Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another meeting of the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. My name is Mike Kanakis, and tonight I am flying solo. My co-host, Phil Bossman, is on hiatus this evening, and according to the comments, it may not be a better situation. We'll have to see how that goes. But tonight we're
Mike,
going to be talking. Go ahead.
Mike,
Sorry.
you know better than to read the comments. Do not read the comments.
Uh, but presenting tonight is a longtime friend of the group and also part-time co-host of the group. So let's say hello to Mr. Steven Judd. Hey, Steve, how are you tonight?
Hey, Mike, I'm doing well. I'm excited about the content. Looking forward to delivering it. I hope that it achieves the objective, which is to get some material across. Might hear a dad joke or two. I've got my I've got my PS Linux hat on. See, it's all shiny.
Yeah. So I was just going to say you are completely you are ready to go with swag. You are fully representing.
Yep.
So let's do this the right way. Let's do it formal. So there's going to be some people that watch this that maybe have never met you or I. Why don't you
Okay.
tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
All right. Well, as you introduced me, I am Steven Judd. I am now into my 30th years of doing IT. I started out at help desk, doing phone support for a bank, and I moved my way up through the ranks to do desktop support, and then did some server apps. Switched industries to a .com. .com went broke, as they are wont to do sometimes. So I moved into the oil and gas industry, was there for many years, and then I went to a social media company that some people may have heard of, maybe recently because they had yet another oops that happened. And then I recently transitioned from there to a software as a service company in the transportation industry.
And so you said 30 years. I didn't know you got started with your first job at age 5. That's pretty
Yeah,
great.
yeah, man. My parents did not believe in child labor laws. And so, they rolled me out pretty early.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you here in a second, but just a quick little setup here. So, uh, what's the concept for this talk tonight? How did you come up with this topic, and how is it relevant to like what you do?
All right. Well, for some people that know, PowerShell took a turn because they wanted to become multi-platform, and so they released PowerShell Core back when it was version 6, and they said, "Okay, we're done with just pushing forward Windows PowerShell, and now we're doing PowerShell Core." They rebranded PowerShell Core at version 7 to be PowerShell, and it is the cross-platform PowerShell. That's cool and all, but if you're like me and your primary skill was Windows administration and a whole lot of Windows administration, actually, then you're like, hey, that's nice. What's the point? So, um, recently, like I said, I went to the software as a service company and they have 0 Windows servers. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to talk about my experience transitioning from a Windows centric admin role to a Linux centric admin role.
And so I'll just add a little color in there because if you're not familiar with Stephen Judd, he's a very active community member and is very generous with his time. He's done quite a number of demos for our user group and others. He's presenting this year at PowerShell Summit. But the key point here is that Stephen is very well versed in the world of PowerShell, so much so that he is comfortable enough to work as a mentor and a trainer on those topics. And so it's quite ironic to work for a company that has no Windows servers and be living in a Linux world. But I guess that's sort of the impetus of the talk here.
That's right. And that was really what got me thinking about this talk. Is like how do you transition into it? And Linux definitely has its place in the world and it has made a strong foothold. And so I'm going to be talking about some of that as well. And then if I get to the end and I miss something, then we'll have some Q&A.
And and I don't want to jump ahead because I sort of know the content, but I would hasten to say that that start with Linux for you wasn't exactly a walk in the park, right? That was a pretty intense learning curve.
Well, anytime you're thrown out of your area of comfort, then the waters can get pretty rough. And so, there's some gotchas that you need to watch out for, and I'm hoping to cover some of those as well.
Yeah, I only brought that up because some people think like, someone has mastered a topic, they jump right to another one and it just is easy. And that's not
Oh,
necessarily always the case.
oh my goodness. Yeah. So someone asked me one time, I think it was on the PowerShell podcast, the excellent podcast Andrew Pla is currently hosting, and he said, what would you tell your younger self? And one of the things I said was, don't be as afraid, because when you're starting something new, everything seems hard. It only seems easy to people who already know the answer. In the meantime, there's some struggle involved, and this is an industry that you have to continue to evolve and adapt and learn. There's a lot of industries that are like that, but IT is just so ruthless about, well, let's take this thing that we've been doing and throw it away and get something new.
Hmm.
So that's just something you have to deal with. Been doing it my entire career, continue to do it right now.
All right. Well, if you're ready, that is a good transition. So we'll turn it over to you and
Okay.
looking forward to the content.
All right, I'm going to see if I can get my dual monitor presentation set up here. Let's see, did it start sharing? Here we go. Here we go. All right, should be seeing slide number one
Yep.
now. Is that what everyone's seeing?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. All right. So this will be entertaining, or at least I hope this will be entertaining. That's the whole point of these talks, is not just to learn something, but to also entertain you and, keep it keep it lively. Let's learn some fun stuff. So this is using PowerShell to be a Linux administrator, presented by me. And when I click the button, it's supposed to go to the next slide. There we go. There we go. So who is this talk for? Well, it's obviously for the people attending, but it's primarily for Windows users that need to use Linux, and need to use being the key. This is not a talk to convince Linux users to start using Windows, because one, I bet you already do, because we've heard your groans, those Linux administrators. And unlike this person, I don't like to mess with penguins, because they look little cute, but they got some bite to them, so you got to watch out. But the interesting thing is there's been a Stack Overflow trend that I'm going to see if I can get to pull up here. Where is my Stack Overflow trend? How many windows did I have open? Here we go. And if you look at that chart, the blue line is the PowerShell percent of Stack Overflow questions this month. So you've got PowerShell on the rise, and Bash, interesting, it kind of plateaued and came back a little bit. And so when I look at that, I'm like, oh, okay, well, it's interesting that more people are moving to this. Now, of course, I'm not a statistician, so I don't know exactly what all that plays into, but I found that to be interesting. All right, let's get back to the presentation. I was hoping I might convince at least one Linux user to start using PowerShell. So that's something we can do here. One of my best PowerShell success stories with Linux was I convinced the lead Linux administrator at the oil and gas company to deploy PowerShell onto all the Linux servers. And that was really cool because it took a little bit of work with him to show him how PowerShell was useful to him as a Linux administrator. And once he kind of had that aha moment, he's like, you know what? This is something we need everywhere. And so he rolled it out. But the question is like, well, how did I become an administrator, a Linux administrator specifically? And the answer was simple. You got to pay the bills. See, I was very happy being a Windows, Azure Cloud, DevOps, digital security, enterprise messaging administrator. And yes, those were all roles I had, and I kind of had to trim it in order to get it onto the slide. But when those positions were eliminated, I needed a new position, because that's sometimes the curveballs that life sends to you. So my skills rhymed. Now, what do I mean by that? So when I got hired, I asked I asked my boss, I said, why did you hire a traditionally Windows administrator? Me. I'm like, and the answer was, well, yeah, you don't have the direct experience, but what you do have rhymes with what we have. So my skills rhymed. I was like, okay, well, what's that look like? Well, if you can solve a problem on Windows, you can solve problems on Linux because problem resolution, what's the word I'm looking for? Troubleshooting skills. That's what I'm looking for. Those are skills that you can use here, there, and everywhere. So if you can solve one, you can solve the other. Also, if you're comfortable automating using PowerShell, you can automate using Bash. Oh, you don't want to use Bash? You want to use Python? Okay, use Python. Oh, you don't want that? You want to use Ruby? You want to use any programming language. It's amazing how structured they are because science, and we expect things to work that way. And so now I work at a SaaS company with 0 Windows servers. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the inescapable parts. So in other words, if you don't know these items, PowerShell's not going to help you. Okay. Text. Seems like did I forget something in this slide? No, I didn't. Because Linux is fundamentally a text-based operating system. In other words, if you cannot read or edit text files, you're in trouble. Okay. Cat, more or less. That's a cat, more or less, right? Okay, someone's going to have to come off mute and either groan or something. It's really hard to do this, online. Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate that. All right, so the cat, more or less. You need to be able to get the content. You need to look at the content, but not have it scroll by and take off. That's what the more is, right? And less, interesting, there's not really a less equivalent in PowerShell. So that's why I put $null there, because less is kind of like a console-based text editor, not an editor, text reader, so that you can scroll up and scroll down and page up and page down and all that. So PowerShell doesn't really have something equivalent to that. But so that's reading, but you also need to be able to write. So we got Vi, Vim, Nano, Emacs, all this. I'm not going to fight you over a text editor because I know my audience and you all have too much Vim and vigor for me.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go. All right. But the thing is, you must know one that's available. So this is a digital security principle in that living off the land, that's what LOTL means. It's not just a principle for digital security. Almost everything has Vi. Almost everything nowadays has Vim. Most of them have Nano. Emacs you're going to have to install. So if you're a big fan of that, that's fine. Just you're going to need to know the other ones as well. Chmod, short for change mode. So this is another Linux thing, Linux command that you just can't escape. So in other words, you need to be able to read these. And these are properties on files and directories and links. And actually, there's a big long list of those to see what kind of files you have. And you don't want to be this guy, because 007 is really dumb permissions to have on a spy. Now, if you understand Linux permissions, you know that that's no access, all access, and the all access goes on the everyone. But this is what I mean by you need to understand chmod, and you need to understand what those letters mean and what those options are. And I see in the chat.
Is this the part where we go again?
A little bit. I see in the chat that someone's a monster and they just set everything to 777. Please don't set everything to 777. All right, rolling on. Then there's chown, or change owner. So this one, you have to be careful because you're only one backwards R from clowning yourself. Do you get it? Here's chown, that little hook on the H. All right, I just clowned myself. Never mind. All right, so this is one of the hardest concepts for Windows admins to get used to in POSIX style file systems, because next to cap sensitivity, which is an abomination, by the way, come at me, bro, on that one. I can't tell you how many times I've tripped up on cap sensitivity in Linux file systems. But POSIX has owner, group, and everyone permissions, and that's it. And the group is one group. If you're used to NTFS, you know that NTFS has the many-to-one relationship to permissions. So, for example, you need to add user A, user B, plus the people in, let's say, purchasing to a directory. You can do that. In POSIX, you kind of have to do a little group dance in order for that to work properly. So this is one of those areas where I really think that the NTFS file system has a lot more power and a lot more capability than the POSIX does. But POSIX's been around a long time, so they weren't thinking about nested groups necessarily at the time. So where will PowerShell help? Because if you have to know certain things, and oh, by the way, that was not anywhere near an exhaustive list, but these are the cores that I think you really have to know in order to move forward. So then you move into PowerShell and you say, okay, well, how's PowerShell going to help me be a better administrator when it comes to Linux? And so you want to list files. Well, in Linux, it's ls, and in PowerShell, it's get child item. All right, well, those line up. You can also use dir or GCI if you prefer the aliases for shorter typing. How about list processes? Well, you got PS and you got GPS for get process. List command locations. Which? Well, I need to know where my executable is, and which will traverse the environment path that you have and try to go find whatever commands you have. And that's what it'll do. Well, get command will do the exact same thing. It'll go look down your modules that you have installed, what functions you have available. If you've got autoload enabled, it will show up. And then and it'll try to find the commands as well. And then finally, if you're going to search for files, well, this is where you use find. Now, find in Linux is very powerful. Now, you can do get child item with filter and do finds also. But what find can do is it has an execution switch to it so that you can run commands against the files that it finds for you. In PowerShell, sure, we can do that too, and we don't do it inside find. We just pipe it into a commandlet, or we pipe it into for each, and then we tell it what we want to do next to there. So you can kind of see how, if you know one, you can kind of know the other. And if you're already familiar with PowerShell, these things that Linux does, you're already set up in order to be able to do it. So if you're going to get started with PowerShell on Linux, the very next thing you got to know is you got to do get permission. Now, get permission is not a real commandlet, but you need it anyway. Don't just go put Linux, PowerShell on all your Linux servers, or as many that you have rights to, and be like, haha, I did it. That's kind of a career limiting move if you do that in the wrong place, or it may be a resume generating event. Don't do that. I'm advising you. But you're going to have to go talk to the security team if you have a security team. If you are the security team, go find a mirror and go talk to the security team. Because anytime you add something to a server, you're increasing the attack surface on that server. So these people are going to want to know, what are you doing here? And the point that you're going to want to get to security is by the time an attacker has console access to your server, you're already toast. It's too late. They're in. Because PowerShell is a shell. It's just a way to run commands. Now, it's either running the native commands in PowerShell or it's running the native Linux commands. But it's just the shell and it's running the commands. Let's see. The connection to the Linux server is going over SSH, so it's secure. So security is going to be happy to hear that. The commands are run on Linux are controlled by the operating system. So in other words, if in Bash or ZCH or KSH, whatever you're running, whatever shell you're running. If you can't run them in that, then you can't run them in PowerShell. That's how it works. Also, in the same way that you don't randomly download or compile and run code on your servers, don't randomly download and run scripts and functions and modules on your servers. The same principles that we're used to in PowerShell apply is read the code, pull from known locations, be careful, because when you hit enter, it's you hitting enter, not the script writer or the coder hitting enter. Right? So I'm just cautioning you to protect your career. Let's see, what's next? So installing PowerShell on Linux. So you got permission, you ran the right function and you got permission. Now it's time to install it. I recommend that you read the documentation. Surprise! If you go to Microsoft Learn, they have good documentation on how to install PowerShell on Linux. And the reason I tell you to read the instructions is because unlike Windows and Windows PowerShell, it doesn't come native. So you need to know what the requirements are and how to get it installed. And there are subtle differences. Anybody who's worked any time with Linux has probably lost a little bit of enamel on their teeth as they're trying to discover the differences between the various flavors of Unix that they have been required to work on. At least that has been my experience. Oh, this thing installed in opt. Oh, no, that time it installed in USR. Nope, that went to etc. These are all your standard locations in the root file system, but based on which distro you're using, things may move around. That's frustrating. You need to know the subtle differences. Thing I find interesting is that I figured Alpine support must have peaked earlier. Because if you go look at the documents for Alpine, I'm picking on Alpine, but if you look here, it's like, okay, well, I've got greens on the left and red X's and construction zones and caution circles. What do all those mean? Okay, well, the green indicates it's supported. Circle is this. You guys can read. I don't have to read this part of the slide to you, but I find it interesting that there's no love for Alpine in this, or at least currently. So if you go look at the other versions, this is the kind of thing you need to look at. It's like, is my version supported? How do I get it installed? What are the requirements? Okay, I think I've beat on that a little long enough. So let's talk about deploying and controlling the PowerShell configuration. Another thing that administrators and the security people and probably management are going to want to know. How do we keep control over what PowerShell can do? In Windows, you do it through GPO. That's the right way to do it. Or there's other ways to do it. But I'm going to talk about Linux, because that's what we're here for. The PowerShell.config.json file will control how PowerShell runs when you load the shell. You can modify the file, but if you modify it from within PowerShell, your modifications are not going to take effect until you reload the shell. Did you know that this file also exists on Windows? I didn't know that until I started digging into it. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And there are some features in the PowerShell.config.json file that are only available on Windows. So if you add those features to your Linux, they won't work. And then there's some that are very Linux specific. But where is this file? So if you're going to set it up for all users of a system, then that goes in the PS home directory. If you're going to set it up for a specific user, well, that goes in the profile current user, current host path. Okay. I put split path on there because it'll go find the parent directory where your profile is stored. Okay. And again, documentation is good on this for what do the various pieces of the PowerShell config show. For example, one of the things that's in there is the execution policy. So is it remote signed? Is it, I'm gonna go and forget some of the other options. Remote signed is the one I can think of because that's the one I tend to always use, but unsigned, I think, is one of them as well. See, that's what happens when you go off script. You kind of get deer in the headlight a little bit. So
It's
logging is also in there, and the logging is very important because you're going to want logs for what your commands are doing. Execution policy, I already mentioned that. I should have stuck with my slides. I had that in there. And then module paths. So this is where the paths to your modules are. So if you want to do a mounted drive on all of your Linux systems and store your modules that are relevant to all systems in your environment, then you can add module path to the PowerShell config JSON file and have it in there for all that. And there's more. So I really recommend that you read the documentation on that. I have just started digging into this, and it's interesting to me because I haven't been exposed to it before. And so I wish I had better advice to give you, but I'm still pretty new on this particular journey. So um, if anyone has any comments on that or would like to point me into some gotchas, I would gladly take them.
So I'm curious about I'm curious about and this may not be the right time to ask this question, but maybe we'll shelve it for later if you feel it's a better time. But so I love all the information you're sharing, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Um, but there's a certain level of comfort and experience that comes from running things over and over again. So, like, how do you find yourself adapting, being put in this new world? You know, the relationship of commands, you know the concept, but I'm sure there's just a speed bump in doing things not as fast as you used to do, right? It's probably a little bit of a frustration. Like your brain can work faster than you probably can get the fingers to work in some of this stuff.
The trick on that, that's a really good point, by the way, Mike, is that the frustration comes in that I know how to do things in one environment and I'm in a new environment and I don't know how to do it. So even when I mention the skills rhyme, it doesn't mean you know how to do things. So there, um, I'm not sure if I have it in my examples, but there was a command that I ran against all of our servers to go find out what Git version there there was installed on all of the servers. And then once I pulled that back, I put that into PowerShell because for me, it was easier to sort and group in PowerShell than it was to do it in Linux, or excuse me, in Bash. So I took what I knew already and applied that, and then I delivered that to my boss who asked me what the question was. And his response was, how did you do that? Because apparently, a group object in PowerShell is easy. You just pipe in a group object and it just does it for you. Here's your server name, here's your versions, group them, I'm done. That apparently is somewhat challenging to do in Bash. I didn't know that. I didn't care to know that. I just did it in PowerShell. Is that an example that you were looking for, Mike?
Yeah, definitely. And I was curious, and again, this may not be appropriate, is how do you find that your peers have sort of accepted sort of a PowerShell view of the world for something that they probably are very, comfortable with their native tools?
Back to intro slide is I'm not trying to convert Bash users to PowerShell. I'm trying to make myself effective.
Yeah,
That's
but
one of
it's got to
the
be the topic of conversation at some point,
right.
right?
Right. As long as, like, once I got approved for PowerShell to be on the servers, the major hurdle was over. Then it's just me being effective. The more effective I am, the more your coworkers and peers and boss will see, wow, being effective there, that he's getting answers quick. Plus, in my current role, I have a coworker who's also quite good at PowerShell. And so when he sees some of the things I'm doing, he's like, oh yeah, yeah, that's something I want to start doing now too, because it's just he already knows it. I don't have to explain it, and then you kind of get you know a momentum and a mass moving through your organization. Like I said, the best thing I did at the oil and gas company was to get the lead Unix administrator excited about PowerShell. Once that happened, it was easy to do Linux PowerShell there.
Hmm. So I guess really what you're saying here is there's more than one way to solve the problem, right? And so
Sure.
yeah, that's really the thing here.
Yeah.
And once you understand the concepts, and as you highlighted, the commands that you can do the work with, you can really make some inroads.
For sure.
Yeah.
I showed one of our developers what I was doing in PowerShell to get an answer that he asked, and his comment was, "Oh, that's interesting. I thought PowerShell was a shell." I'm like, "Okay, well, it is, but it's also a language and it's object oriented." And once I said the magic words object oriented to a developer, the eyes kind of lit up. It's like, "Ooh." And, that's again, I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm trying to show them what I'm capable of doing in this environment. Okay, let's roll on back to the slides, unless there's any other questions from anyone else.
I'm
Pause for a
keeping an
second.
eye on the chat, and I think we're okay right now.
Okay. Yeah, I was glancing at the chat, and sorry, I'm going to throw your name out. Gilbert said, "It's a good sell. You'll never need sed and awk again." Anybody who's fought their way through some sed and awk knows exactly what Gilbert was talking about, and I sure do, because that stuff, and you think regex is bad, maybe regex is bad, but so is sed and awk. That stuff seems very cryptic.
Hmm.
All right. Logging. That's what I wanted to talk about next, because you need to know that Linux logs to the systemd journal by default. All right, you don't know what the systemd journal is? Yeah, neither did I. But that is kind of like the for security logs and system logs. That is the what's the word I'm looking for? The event log for system on Windows equivalent. Okay, and if you're going to read this, the recommendation is that you use journal control command to view the systemd journal. Okay, and so then when you're doing commands in PowerShell, they're going to show up in the systemd journal. Now, this is when I talked about the configuration, you're going to need to turn this on, and you may need to turn it on more or less based on your environment. Just for the record, Mac OS uses Apple's unified logging system. So don't think it's the same as Linux, because it's not. And obviously, Windows uses the event log. Now, when you're setting what your logging is going to be, you have module logging, which records the pipeline execution events, and then you have the script block logging. Now, this one you can set what you want to the script block logger to log, but the options are you can log the commands, you can log the script blocks, functions, and the scripts that go on. Now, that's cool from the digital security side because they're going to want to see everything. But then when you flood them with everything that's coming in, they may think, okay, maybe I need to parse this out. Or maybe we don't need all the commands that are being done by modules we're already familiar with and have already approved. So this is the balance that you're going to have to find in your environment in order to get the information you need that's actionable. And again, like I mentioned, this is controlled in the values within the PowerShell config JSON. So in your environment, if you don't have a way to get the PowerShell config JSON pushed out and manage it from a central location, that's also going to be something you're going to want to look at. So whether you're using Chef or Puppet or Ansible or what's a Satellite, maybe Satellite turned into something else. Maybe that turned into Ansible. I'm not as familiar with those tools in this area, but that's what you're going to want to use in order to get your PowerShell config out.
Hey,
And
can I interrupt with a question?
yes, please.
So, you mentioned having script block logging, and that generates a lot of noise if you say log everything.
Yep.
And can you speak to what people might be wondering? Well, what should I log if you're saying that there's maybe some modules that you want to mark and exclude from script block logging, and why do you still want to log other things?
Ooh, that is a good question. And as much as I don't want to say this, it depends. Because there's going to be people in your organization, assuming you're working with a digital security team, that's going to say, "Give me everything," and you're like, "That's great, but now I have to deal with the noisy logs like you just mentioned." My recommendation is to start with the defaults, because the defaults are there kind of for a reason. They're this is what we think, we, the Microsoft people that wrote this, that configured this is what we also got feedback from community. Because remember, this is open source, and a lot of people go in and discuss this in the GitHub for PowerShell. And so then they're like trying to find the balance, and then you have to tweak it for your environment. I kind of like the module logging one, because you can say, "Hey, I want these modules logged," but I find it interesting that it's the pipeline execution events that those show up. Also find it interesting that in this about logging for the non-Windows PowerShell, and by the way, just a quick throw out, this is how Edge, takes the title of the page and pastes it in. I like it because it makes it easy to search, and you don't have to deal with a really long HTTP : but it doesn't tell you exactly where to go. Um, okay, sorry for going off on a tangent there. Pulling back, the documentation is not as specific as I would like about the details of what the pipeline execution events does specifically. So I was digging in on them recently, but I couldn't make exact sense of what settings did exactly what. So I wish I had more experience on this to give you a definitive answer. I would say check back with me in a few months and I'll be much better versed at it.
I will add one thing to that.
Sure.
Because script block logging happens on the actual execution side, not reading commands, it means if someone is running malicious code, or if they're running unknown random code, you're not going to see the base 64 string that was on the input. You're going to see, here's what actually went into the execution pipeline. And so
Right.
if there is any security related things, you're going to see, here's what actually happened, not the obfuscated code that someone accidentally or intentionally ran.
Right. That's a great call out. Thank you for that. Okay, so now I have the word demo in here, so I was just going to jump over to my PowerShell windows here and see what we got. And so I was going to pull this up. What is all this stuff that I got here? I don't know. I should do the command that I hate so much, clear, and get things cleared out of the way. And then, no, not maximize. Handy little feature in Windows 11 where you can hover and it'll size. So I'm gonna put that one there and go find my other window. Where's my other one? There we go. All right, so PowerShell up above. I'm doing this all in WSL2 running Ubuntu. And down below, I'm going to run the journal control command with -F, so we can follow what's happening here. Okay. Operation canceled. That's very interesting. So if I do sudo ls password, we should see some stuff in the journal. Hey, someone opened root and then it closed. All right, that's interesting. But then if I want to see some PowerShell stuff, what if I do find module poshgit? Oh, it was in my history there. Find module poshgit. Just because it set off my type A alarm, I'm going to capitalize the find module. I'm going to press enter. And I don't see anything. That's funny because in my testing and my demo, it put a bunch of stuff in there. Let's try another one. Maybe because I already looked that one up, it said, hey, you don't want to do anything here. Or this could be demo gods just coming to get me. I'm going to do a regular. Well, I don't know why that's not logging that. Because it did before. It put a bunch of stuff in there. Unfortunately, I don't know how to fix that and not completely sweat a bunch of bullets here. So,
Do you want to close and relaunch, and we can always edit that out?
yeah, like this happened before. What was, because like, okay, internal control, F. Yeah, that's there.
Double check your logging configuration, make sure it's set.
That is the, oh, all right. So that, I just walked myself right into my own problem. I need to do it over here in Kali, and I'll explain why. I'll explain why in some slides. I'll explain why. And I know why this isn't working. And because now I'm really sweating bullets. Let me pull up Kali here. And I remember that this didn't work either. I should have spent more time on my demo. Apologize for that, because this is not going to work and that's not going to work. Okay, rough demo. The demo gods bit me. I'm going to come back to this. Let me go back to the slides because I need to explain what has happened here. So a little bit of a rabbit hole. And by rabbit hole, I don't mean the bourbon. So sorry about that. PowerShell on Ubuntu 22.04 in WSL2. The way I did it in my environment is I ran PWSH straight on the shell. And if you do that in Linux, it will see if you have something installed, and then it'll give you advice if it has advice available. And so the advice it gave me was run this command. You need to run sudo snap install PowerShell. Okay, so I ran that. And by the way, remember where I said read the docs and follow the docs on how to install? I YOLO'd it. Partially because I was curious and I wanted to see what would happen. I'll tell you what happened. It messes up my demos is what happens. Because then after you run that command, it tells you, hey, you can't actually run this. Like you can't, I'm sorry, I was reading the chat and there was a funny comment in there. You can't actually run this command. You have to run this command with Classic installed. I'm like, okay, let me run that. That one actually installed PowerShell. It's like, sweet, now I got it. Now when I run PowerShell, it opened up PowerShell. And I even put it in my slides here. I'm fully aware that I did not follow the instructions. This is a free presentation, free over the internet, sue me. I have no money, so you're not going to get anything. Here's the big gotcha. The big gotcha is that when you use Snap, it installs the Snap packages mounted as a read-only squashfs file system, and you cannot modify the contents. All right, so let me bring that window back up where I was failing miserably and show you which directory I was in. Did it close Ubuntu? I think it crashed. And that, okay. Come all the way back around. Weird. Okay, so PWSH. I'm gonna get into PowerShell in Ubuntu. Get this thing loaded up here. And I'm going to change directory to PS Home. Notice where it is. It's in the Snap PowerShell. So if I do the ls-l, or for the long list, and I'm looking at the permissions. All the permissions are root, which is normal, but if I do, I think it's the, look at the file system it's using. And this is a read-only file system. So what's missing from here? The PowerShell, actually I need to do ls, we'll do ls. Powers S, we'll just do that. Yeah, there's no PowerShell config JSON. Not only that, if I do touch, by the way, I'm showing you a bunch of commands in Linux, but I'm doing this on purpose. PowerShell.config.json. I'm sorry, you cannot create that file. Now we're into beyond my Linux skill is I don't know how to fix this. What I should have done was followed the instructions and installed it properly. So here's what I did. I installed another version of Ubuntu. Watch this. I'm gonna pull a rabbit out of the hat on this rabbit hole. At least I'm gonna try. And now if I do pwsh here, hello, pwsh, and I change directory to PS home. Now I'm in a different directory. And now let's see if I can find my PowerShell config file here. I did cd, not ls. Oops. Remember the advice that you should never type in a demo? Yeah, I should never type in a demo. But now I have a PowerShell config here because I was able to create one in this one because I actually followed the instructions on how to properly install PowerShell. I'm seeing some advice here in the chat, and I'm going to stay away from it because I feel like I'm on a roll here. All right, so this failed completely. Let's just close that, and I'm going to open another version of the same version. I'm going to do journal control F here. Request repeated too quickly. I'm getting some interesting stuff. All right, but now let's see if find module. I used PoshGit initially, so let's try it again. Ooh, looky. Whew. So I was able to get the logging because I was able to create that log. I'm feeling better about my presentation now. Oh, good grief. I need to take some notes. Be like, hey, this is going to fail. Just be ready. Because I already had the rabbit hole slide up. Any questions while I'm paused and trying to catch my breath from that?
I think we're good.
Okay. All right, well, let's move on then. Oh, I had one more item on here. So much for creating the PowerShell config JSON because I didn't follow the instructions. Have I said it enough times to get Sean Wheeler's approval that you should follow the instructions that Microsoft publishes and is there to help you and not do what I did? All right. Important default PowerShell paths. So these are the things that you need to be aware of when you install PowerShell on Linux, because they're important. So you already saw me use PS Home, and the default is opt Microsoft PowerShell 7, unless you use the snap package, which don't do that. I already did that. Don't be me. And then the profile scripts are stored in the following locations. Now note, they're going to be different than what you may be used to if you're used to where they are in Windows. I just listed them. You can look them up. It's easy to do. The other thing you need to know is where the modules are stored. And the modules are stored in these locations. So this is where your user modules are, your shared modules, and your default modules. Now, if you're used to, like I was, the Windows installations and where these paths are on Windows, this comes as a little bit of surprise, especially the user modules. Because if you're not familiar with Linux enough, that tilde at the beginning says your home directory, wherever your home directory is. It's an alias for that. And then the .local is a hidden directory in your home directory. And then it's share and PowerShell and then modules. And I'd like to shout out a big thank you to the capital M for modules on that too, because if you're just typing them and you try to tab complete and you did the lowercase and you're in Bash, that's not going to work. Because remember, I already complained about the case sensitivity of the POSIX file systems. And then finally, the PS readline history. A lot of people love PS readline. I'm fanatical about PS readline because it's so useful, but you need to know that the history is saved in this location. So again, back to the caps, but just let the tab completion help you out and get to your console host history file. Okay. So get differences, yet another non-existent PowerShell command. Here's a big one, Sudo. Sudo is super user do for all of you monsters out there that pronounce it wrong. Also, come at me, bro. It is super user do, so it's pronounced Sudo. This isn't a GIF discussion. Also, you can't just sudo a PowerShell commandlet because one does not simply sudo in PowerShell, right? Running sudo runs the command in the super user shell. The super user shell is not PowerShell, unless you've done some amazingly horrible things to your Linux environment where PowerShell is your default shell for everything. Okay, I said amazingly horrible. I try not to make big changes like that to the defaults. But the point is that sudo runs in a shell, and the shell is not PowerShell. Okay, so I have a function that I wrote. It's super basic, but I'm going to show it to you. That if you do invoke psudo, this will work for you. All right, so let's look at the code. Because like I said, it's very simple, but it'll give you the idea. So I wrote this function just to help me get sudo commands done properly. Okay, and I'm just taking in a script block as a parameter, and then I run it. If it's Linux, I do sudo pwsh and script block. If it's Mac, the same. If it's Windows, I'm sorry, there is no sudo command for Windows. And the same for this is PowerShell 7, and then this will run in Windows PowerShell. And I see you, chat. You're talking about sudo coming, but it's not here today, and this is when I'm giving the presentation. All right, so let's jump back over here, because I want to show you this. I think I'll make this big now that I've done that before. Also increase the font size a little bit, make it good for the recording. And I'm just going to paste this code in here. And now I can do new alias. Oh, I already did it, so it's in my command. But I'm going to do a new alias for the name of psudo and give it that value of the function I just created. All right, that's good. So now I can do psudo script block ls. I'm cheating because this is so simple. And it asks for my password. And there you go. I find that to be pretty useful. Hopefully you can get that. I haven't put this up on a GIST or in my GitHub. I'm sure other people have better solutions. I didn't go searching for them. I just banged this out because that's part of what I think is fun about PowerShell is to do your version and then go look for other people's versions and see how you could have done it and how they did it. Because you learn a lot more from fighting your way through it yourself and coming up with your own solution. And maybe you find that you like yours better, and then you can share your version. All right, so back to the slides. I see a comment out here that Sudo is really good. 10 of 10 would recommend. Why would you recommend Sudo, and why is it really good?
Works in PowerShell.
Sweet. Okay.
It's
I hadn't heard of it.
Yeah, sudo for Windows, and it works in PowerShell.
Oh, interesting. So that isn't what I was doing, which was trying to get sudo to work in PowerShell in Linux. That's getting sudo to work in Windows in PowerShell.
Yes, it works. It works in Windows in whatever shell, but it allows you to use sudo to elevate a commandlet instead of just a native command.
Interesting. Maybe a question that you don't know on that, but does it follow the order of operations in PowerShell? So it'll do commandlets, but it'll also do native commands?
Yes.
Okay, that's awesome. I'll have to look into that. Thanks. All right. Next. Shh. I'm still talking. Oh, I misspelled shh. All right, whatever. Yes, you can set up SSH from PowerShell to Linux servers. And if you're used to using PowerShell on your local workstation and you want to connect to both Windows and Linux, this is very useful. Unfortunately, it isn't simply that the SSH that you already have on your Linux servers is ready to go and you can just start using this. You have to add a PowerShell subsystem entry in order for this to work, so that you can do things like, well, I'm going to talk about the commands in a minute. Let me get to the doc here. So you just want to read the Microsoft Learn doc on this so that you get this set up properly. And now you're back to having chats with the Linux and security teams because you remember increasing the attack surface. They're going to want to know why you're making changes to SSH, because SSH in a lot of places is sacrosanct and they are not going to tolerate any changes to it. So tread lightly here. The usage of how you do that is for new PS session, enter PS session, invoke command, you can use SSH natively via the hostname parameter. And so now you're running PowerShell version 7 on your local workstation, but you need to connect to Windows and Linux, or you want to just connect to Linux, you can do that directly through the remoting over SSH. There are some limitations that you need to be aware of. For example, there's no remote endpoint configuration or just enough administration. If those aren't constraints for you, sweet, you're good to go. In my environment, those aren't constraints for me, so I'm not worried about it. You need to be aware of broken windows. If you're going to be using using PowerShell on Linux, this is something you need to know about. There is no WMI on Linux. It's Windows Management and Instrumentation. Obviously, there's not. But wait, you said I have SIM. Hey, that's great. But there are still many scripts that use WMI components. They're going to blow up on you when you run them in PowerShell 7, whether you're running it on Windows or whether you're running it on Linux. They will not work. That's interesting and it's great knowledge, but when it blows up in your face when you're trying to get something done, then you'll be feeling that. Okay. Also, there are some WMI commands that don't have equivalent SIM commands. For example, I was just fooling around with this many years ago, setting the laptop brightness through WMI. You can't set the laptop brightness through SIM. You can look at it, you can get the information, but you can't change it. So if you wrote something to do that, like I did for fun, it's not going to work. You need to know about these things. It's going to happen. DLLs. What do you mean DLLs? Well, some modules ship with DLLs. Like, really? That's interesting. Also, PowerShell on Linux has DLLs. When I saw that, I went, what? That's interesting. I didn't know that. It's unlikely that the DLLs will be compatible with Linux unless they were specifically coded to be compatible. So if you have some modules or some code and you got DLLs, just beware, because when you try to get those to work on Linux, you're like, hey, this works on Windows. Let's try it over here. It may not work. Okay. So I've given you some things to think about on this. But the question is, why bother? Like, why would I go through any pain, much less what you've kind of been describing for me, especially when I have to go talk to the security team and they're going to tell me no because they're the department of no? Why would I want to try to get PowerShell into my environment, especially if you have to know the Linux commands anyway? There's so much of my work that I do today that you just have to know the Linux commands anyway because you're having to use them. The trick is, and this is what Mike was kind of driving at, is you leverage your PowerShell knowledge. Take what you already know and use that to your advantage. Because in PowerShell, in lots of code, readability matters. Okay. Now I've heard this counter argument, which is PowerShell is too verbose. I want to type less. The question really is, which one of these commands would you rather read? Would you like to read this find command, or would you like to read this PowerShell command? Apologize for the small font. I just realized looking at this, I probably should make it a little larger so it's easier to read. These two commands do the same thing, basically. Output's slightly different because the find command outputs text, and the PowerShell command outputs an object that you can then continue to manipulate. But what it's doing is, if those of you who already read it, you're like, oh, I know what it's doing. But for those of you who haven't, it's saying, go find me all the files that have the name error in them, but not the ones that begin with the word status. So if it's status error, I don't want those. And then I want to put those in the variable file list. Then I'm going to take the file list, I'm going to sort them by length. I'm going to take the last 5 in the length so I get the 5 largest ones. And then I'm going to measure them on an average on size. And then for the averages, I'm going to convert those to gigabytes. If I don't get them because there's not any files in there, that's what the else is for, so that I handle ugly output. Now, granted, both of these commands are complicated. But if you're a PowerShell person, you can read the second one and go, I know what that's doing. If you're not a PowerShell, remember Gilbert's comment about sed and awk. There's some awk in there, okay? PowerShell readability helps future you and people other than you. That's why we do it. That's why I bother. Also, objects. Man, I love objects. Once I had the light bulb moment of how PowerShell is an object-oriented shell and that everything it outputs is an object, I said, all right, so like a good defense attorney, I object. Where's my mic comment there? Come on now. All right.
That was
Okay,
funny.
fine. You guys better, I go back. You guys better be ready, because they're going to come fast and furious now. Because parsing text can be crazy hard and complicated. Nobody wants to deal with a lot of text. Sorry if I said something awkward, right? So what you know,
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I need to intervene here. I knew this was coming, and I do apologize in advance. I probably should have put a disclaimer up. We have looked past some of the deficiencies of Steven's jokes because the information is still valuable. Please bear with us. It's a slight programming change for the next probably 6 minutes, and then we'll return to normal again.
Okay, fine. But there are more, so brace yourselves. So objects are easy if you can use a native PowerShell command line. That's awesome, because if you're doing get child item, get process, stop process, get content, it just outputs the objects. Otherwise, you need to have a drink because you look parsed. That joke is for you're going to have to parse some text. It is a text-based operating system. A lot of the commands you're going to be working on in Linux are going to be putting out text. You're going to have to parse them. especially if you want to convert them to an object or deal with them in another way. There's just going to be commands that output the text. You're going to want to use and manipulate this output to get your stuff into nice columns and get everything super cool. So you're going to have to get comfortable with regex, right? Everybody loves regex, or at least I love regex. Not everybody loves regex. All right. Which you're going to have to do with sed and awk anyway. If you're doing a bunch of sed commands, you're doing regular expressions already. If you're doing grep, if you're doing select string, if you're doing match, if you're doing replace, you're dealing with regex anyway. Okay, I'm not going to stop encouraging people to learn regex. Once I did learn it, yeah, it looks weird at start, but once I did learn it, it's like, this is really powerful. You can do a lot with it. And then you get to the valley of despair and you're like, why did I learn regex? This is so hard, and because you've gone past the basics. Anyway, it's my shout out for regex 101. I love the UI. I love the help. I love the examples. I recommend regex 101 to everyone. However, you need to know that it uses a different regex engine than what's in PowerShell. The regexer uses the .NET regex engine. So if you get some weird results, you might want to take a look at that. And then if you want to stay in PowerShell and you want to try to use some English, take a look at Irregular by James Brundage. It's pretty slick. You just tell it what you want. And then, of course, it's not on my slide. I probably should have put it on my slide. ChatGPT is actually quite good at generating regex commands. Beware of the fact that it may hallucinate. James's module is very specific, and everything that's in there is intentional. ChatGPT, it can make some junk up. All right, fair warning. So Linux commands work in PowerShell. So this is the best part of having it be a shell. So the native commands, they work. But you need to be aware of the PowerShell command precedence. If you don't already know that, then you need to know that aliases come first. And the default aliases in Linux are different than they are in Windows. Okay? The big one for me is ls. I started typing ls back in 2010 once I discovered that that was an alias for dir, which was an alias for gci, which is an alias for get child item. Okay, I said this all backwards. They're all aliases for get child item. Don't come at me just yet. That's not a come at me, bro moment. And I got used to typing ls. Now that I'm in Linux, I type ls in PowerShell and I get the Linux ls, and that's not the one I wanted. I wanted get child item. So now I'm kind of broken in that I got used to it being one way and the whatever. But you need to know that the aliases come first. Okay, then functions, then commandlets, then native executables. Now here's an interesting thing that you may or may not know, that you need to know your command search order. So in other words, the in-memory modules and commandlets and functions and aliases, those pop up first. So when it says function and commandlet before an executable, if you don't already have it loaded, then an executable can actually show up before a function or a commandlet, depending upon what you have set for your PS module auto-loading preference. Again, read the docs. This is all in there. Also, you need to know your env path. I don't know why Linux variables are all caps and Windows are mixed, but whatever. The env path, you need to know that, because this is where your Linux PowerShell is going to go look for executables, and you also need to pay attention to your PS module path, because that's where it's going to go look for commandlets and functions that are not already loaded in memory. Whew, that's a lot. Okay. I've talked long, I've talked hard, I've talked fast, so now I'm going to get you to the summary judgment. This is where we decide whether this time was well spent or whether I can sneak some more dad jokes in on you. So basically, I'm saying that having PowerShell installed on Linux can help you, especially with complex commands, using the pipeline. The pipeline in PowerShell is the power of PowerShell. It will help you. And parsing text. I'll just go ahead and say that. But the thing I was thinking about is One thing I love in PowerShell is if you do get process and you pipe that to remove process, or if you're using the PowerShell aliases, you do GPS pipe, I think it's kill. No, kill's also in Linux. I don't know what remove process is, aliases in Linux, come to think of it, because I just use kill. But kill doesn't work in Linux because you can't pipe into it. So what I was doing in Linux is I was having to do PS, go find it, get the process ID, and then do kill on that number. Well, in PowerShell, I don't have to do that. I just do get process, find it, pipe it into remove process, boom, sucker's gone. It's great that way. Do remember the living off the land principle. You still need to know the Linux commands. Objects matter. I talked a lot about objects. Objects matter. That's how I was able to impress my boss with how I got which count of servers had which versions, because I was able to use the group command. And because I had all my content in objects, boom, nailed it. The familiarity will speed your adoption. You'll get better at Linux faster if you're using a tool you're comfortable with. That's an advantage to you. And then being a both and administrator is valuable. Being able to do Windows and do Linux, do PowerShell and do Bash, the more skills you have, the more versatile you are, the better you're going to be. In fact, Don Jones actually gave a both and talk at PowerShell Summit 2019, and I remember it because he's saying if you know Azure and you know AWS, you're going to be more valuable than someone who knows one or the other. Now, again, remember that skills rhyme. Okay, so being good at one means you'll be able to translate quickly to another, but that doesn't mean you already have it. So try to get some additional skills added to your resume, and that's what I'm doing. All right, that's the summary judgment, as someone tongue-in-cheek said there in chat. Thank you very much. See, it's contagious, Mike. I'm getting a bigger audience where other people are telling their jokes. I love it. So I need a goodbye function in order to close out this presentation. So for each win in your strife, if you sharpen like knife, this may be a gimmick, it's also a limerick. So go forth and shortcut your life. And that is my presentation. Oh, that's so corny. I almost choked on it.
Well,
shoot.
Jokes aside, I enjoyed that. There was a lot of useful comparatives of the operating systems there. I thought it was very well done.
All right. So here's my final slide. This is my stay in touch slide. I went with the DSC almost naming of X Twitter. Like, why not? I thought it was funny. I'm at Steven Judd on Twitter. LinkedIn, you can hit me up there. I know that LinkedIn kind of has become in vogue and it's really cool and you have good audience reach. I love it. Discord, at Judd Missile, now that I don't have numbers anymore on my name. Please don't try and reach me on ICQ. That's there so I can brag about how low my number is. That's it. Here's my blog. All my code goes up on GitHub, Steven Judd. This presentation is not there yet because it's not fully baked, and I want to get it solid before I get it up there. And then the My Content list, I built that to say, here's the presentations I've done, the podcasts that I've been a part of, some books that I've participated in, either writing or editing or contributing to. And that's me on one slide. Awesome.
Nice.
Thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you learned something valuable, even if it was to beware of dad jokes.
All right, so I think we'll put a button on this, a nice bow on this, and wrap this up. There's been a vigorous chat going on, talking about various topics and pieces of tidbits that you've shared with everybody. I think a lot of people have gotten a lot of value from this. I am not a Linux admin at all. I don't have any experience with Linux, very little at all. And so it's very interesting to see the parallels between the two. I enjoyed that very much, and I think this is quite useful for people to understand how they can go about bridging from A to B, B to A, as you said, both and. So let's just say thank you so much for spending some time with us. Steven did a great job as always.
Appreciate that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to remind you, if you made it this far, you should come and join us in person because you get to ask the questions of Steven in the chat and get to enjoy the jokes. If you would like to join us, you can find us at rtpsug.com or on Meetup. You can search for Research Triangle PowerShell User Group, or as I said, RTPSug. Sign up and you can join us for the next meeting. Until then, we want to say a big thank you to Steven Judd, and take a look at the rest of the videos on the YouTube channel. There's something for everyone. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Steven. Have a good night.
Appreciate it.